Hey folks, and welcome back. So, this week we are talking about corporate moral responsibility again. We've already discussed corporate moral personhood. We've discussed whether corporations are the types of entities that can or should be held morally responsible. Are they comprised in such a way that they can engage in intentional action, that they can be guided by reason, or that they are responsive to reasons? And we have determined that, following French, corporations do seem to be the right sort of entity to hold morally responsible. This week, we're going to ask with Phillips whether that matters at all, or when it might matter whether we can hold corporations morally responsible. It won't matter if corporations are not responsive to such holdings. It won't matter if it doesn't change or control corporate behavior, it seems. So are corporations the sort of thing that will respond to being held responsible or morally responsible for their behavior? That's sort of the central question we're going to be wrestling with today. What's the point of examining corporate moral responsibility? Why is it the sort of question that's worth asking in a practical ethics setting? That's what we're after. Phillips says there are various ways of trying to answer this what's the point question. One way of trying to answer it is by saying, well, look, this is just an intrinsically interesting philosophical question. And that seems to be what French was thinking, right? It's interesting. It's a good question. Are corporations moral persons? Are they moral agents? Are they the sorts of things that can be held accountable for their actions, morally accountable for their actions? Like, that's interesting. That's intriguing. That's the sort of question that makes philosophers go, yes, I see. Right? That's what we do for a living. But for most people, that's not a good motivation for examining corporate moral responsibility. If you're not going on to be a philosopher, but you're going on to work in the business world, you're going to say, who cares if it's an interesting philosophical question? I want to know if it matters in practice. So what are some ways that it might matter in practice? Well, one way it might matter in practice is that it helps us determine who to blame. We always want to blame someone when something goes wrong. We always want to point that finger and say, it was your fault that this got screwed up or that got screwed up or that they got hurt or that the environment got damaged. Right? It was somebody's fault. We want to be able to blame someone. Well, who should we blame? Maybe sometimes we should blame the corporation itself. Maybe it's the kind of entity that deserves that blame even when no individual member of that corporation, no individual employee, no individual shareholder, no individual person on the board of directors was responsible for the act. No individual deserves the blame. So there's one question that we might want to ask, or one motivation that we might have for asking the question of moral responsibility or corporate moral responsibility. We just want to know who to blame. We want to know if it's appropriate sometimes to blame the corporation. Well, okay, that might have some practical significance insofar as sometimes we just want to know who we should be outraged at, and we don't care if it changes anything. I just want to know who I should be pissed at right now, right? But there's a more important question that Phillips thinks we should be asking. We should be asking whether it has important consequences for the control of corporate behavior. If holding corporations morally responsible allows us to shape or change moral behavior in some way, the corporate behavior in some way, that would be important, right? It would be important to be able to change the way that corporations are acting. If moral responsibility plays a role in changing the ways that corporations act, then it seems like it's worth talking about. It's worth examining. So that is Phillips' question here. Can holding corporations morally responsible in fact change their behavior? And if so, how would that work? So he thinks it only matters if it makes a difference in practice. And his question is, does it make a difference in practice? And he breaks this down into two distinct questions that we have to ask. Right? The first of these questions is the question of whether there are actions for which corporations are responsible but individuals within those corporations are not responsible. So the idea is that it seems like most of the time when we hold a corporation responsible, we're also holding its board of directors responsible, or its CEO responsible, or the CFO responsible, or some particular employee who screwed up is being held responsible. And Phillips' idea is that if that's what happens in every case, then we should just hold those individual people responsible and forget about corporate moral responsibility. But if there are cases where the corporation itself is morally responsible and no individual within the corporation is morally responsible, then those are the cases where we want to be able to hold the corporation as a whole, as an entity, morally responsible, even when no individual is morally responsible. So those are the cases that are really going to matter. We want to be able to identify those cases. Do they exist? So that's going to be the first question that Phillips tries to answer, and it's going to take most of our time this week just trying to answer that question. The second question then, once you have an answer to that question, an answer in the affirmative, you say, yeah, there are such cases, then the second question we need to ask is whether holding corporations responsible for actions is likely to change their behavior. Right? So then we get to ask the practical question, and we'll get to that later in this week's lectures. But before we get to those two questions, which we're going to take in turn, we have to cover a few preliminaries. The first one just has to do with blameworthiness and intentionality. So I've been talking about blameworthiness, whether corporations are the sorts of things that can be blamed, whether their actions are blameworthy. And so we should be a little bit more specific about what that means. So we'll say that one is blameworthy for an event, whatever event it is, that results from an act that one intends and that is causally related to one's act. So your act is to be an intentional act, and the event for which you are blameworthy has to be causally related to one's act. It has to somehow follow from what you did. And corporations intend to bring about an event when they act in a way that predictably brings that event about, and when they have a corporate reason to bring that event about. So the idea is that, is French's idea, that corporations act for corporate reasons. They are intentional beings or intentional agents. They act for or he called them Davidsonian agents. They act for corporate reasons, and their actions predictably bring about some events. They're blameworthy for the events that their intentional actions predictably bring about. But it's not just intentional actions, or it's not just events that corporations intend to bring about for which they are blameworthy. It's not just events that individuals intend to bring about for which we are blameworthy. In many cases, the things for which we are blameworthy are not outcomes that we intended, right? We acted with some intention. We acted to bring some outcome about, and then there were some other effects of that, some side effects of that, some knock-on effects of that, that were harmful and that we are held responsible for. So we don't want to construe intention too narrowly. We don't want to just focus on the thing that you wanted to bring about, the event that you wanted to happen or that a corporation wanted to happen, but rather the other events that follow from its acting in a particular way to bring about something that it wants. One is responsible for the events that predictably follow from one's intentional acts, even if one didn't intend to bring those results about. So here, the ideas that are really important are ideas of negligence and recklessness. Right? We say that someone is negligent when they fail to foresee a risk of harm to others. So negligence is the unintentional failure to avoid a reasonably foreseeable risk of harm to others. So it's not that they knew that this event would come about and acted anyway. It's that they were unaware that this was a likely effect of their action, but they should have been aware. They had a responsibility to know. They should have been aware of this foreseeable risk. It's a reasonably foreseeable risk. Anyone who was taking the actions that they took should have figured out that this was likely to follow, or that this was a risk that was downstream from their acting. So negligence has to do with what one should know or ought to know before they act, but they fail to know. Recklessness, on the other hand, is behavior involving known high risk of harm to others. So if you act recklessly, you knew that your act was likely to harm others, and you did it anyway. Right? You knew it was likely to bring about some problematic consequences, but you did it anyway. That's recklessness. All right, I'm going to stop this lecture right here, and we'll pick back up in the next lecture by addressing the first question that Phillips asks.